Hello, everyone, and it's good to see you all. Thank you all for joining us today, entitled Human Rights Violations in the UAE, the State Security Apparatus' Suppression of Dissenting Voices. My name is Ramzi Kais, and I'm a legal and policy officer at MENA Rights Group. And I have the honor today of moderating this discussion by our panelists, Matthew Hedges, Ines Osman, and Janan Al-Marzouqi. Janan unfortunately could not be with us in person during the panel discussion, but she did send a video recording, which we'll be sharing during our panel event. The purpose of holding this online panel event is twofold. On the one hand, today, MENA Rights Group launched its report titled The UAE State Security Apparatus, a Tool of Repression Against Dissenting Voices, which both examines and documents the pattern of human rights violations committed by the State Security Apparatus, or the SSA, in the UAE, particularly since the Arab Spring until this day. The report, which is now available on MENA Rights Group's website, first examines the history and the legal framework that enabled the overarching powers of the SSA, and it also delves into the role of the Emirati judiciary in supporting and enabling the SSA's abuses. The report also maps out the SSA's systematic use of enforced appearances, torture, and arbitrary detention against peaceful critics, human rights defenders, prisoners of conscience more generally, which is something that has been exemplified in the cases that MENA Rights Group has documented. So we're holding this panel discussion to hear from MENA Rights Groups about the findings of their report, but we're also having this discussion to share the testimonies and of survivors and the families of survivors who suffered abuses at the hands of the state security apparatus in the UAE and the Emirati authorities more generally. And we hope this panel provides a space to not only discuss this pattern of abuses committed by the state security apparatus, but to also consider what avenues for accountability remain available. I'm happy to be joined by Ines Osman, who is the Executive Director and co-founder of MENA Rights Group, who will be presenting the main findings of MRG's report on the SSA. As a brief note, MENA Rights Group is a Geneva-based legal advocacy NGO defending and promoting fundamental rights and freedoms in the Middle East and North Africa region. And MENA Rights Group represents victims of human rights before international law mechanisms, and also works to identify the patterns and root causes of violations on the ground and bring key issues to the attention of relevant stakeholders, and calls for legal and policy reform in doing so. Ines, I'd like to give you first the floor to discuss the findings of the report. So you have the floor.
Thank you, Ramzi, and thank you also Matthew and Jinal for joining us today. And looking forward to hearing your views and also your testimony. So the SSA is responsible for carrying out a widespread crackdown on peaceful dissent in the UAE, and is also responsible for the arrest, torture, and detention of a number of individuals that are quite well known, including prominent human rights defender Ahmed Mansour, or human rights lawyer Al-Roken, who's been detained since 2012. And all these cases and many others, and we'll hear more testimonies later, are actually all tied to the SSA. The SSA is actually not a very young institution. It was established in 1974, so 3 years after the UAE was founded. And there's been little to no documentation of abuses committed prior to 2011. However, in the context of the Arab Spring, abuses became not necessarily more prominent, but at least more known. And the most notable case illustrating the state security's crackdown on freedom of expression is the case known as that of the UAE 94, which was a group of academics, lawyers, students, and human rights activists who signed a petition calling for democratic reforms in the UAE. And following that petition, the SSA initiated a campaign of mass arrest, and they subjected the signatories to secret detention without any contact with, family, lawyer, as well as acts of torture. And in 2013, people were tried in a mass trial and sentenced to prison ranging from 7 to 15 years. Despite the fact that several defendants actually raised the fact that they were tortured in court, no investigation was ever carried out into their allegations. And so in the years that followed, UAE authorities continued to crack down on dissent through the state security apparatus, but they also enacted an even more restrictive legal framework that actually criminalizes the exercise of a wide range of fundamental rights and freedoms, which I will go into a bit later. So first, some history and background about the state security apparatus. So as mentioned, it was established in 1974 and was actually initially placed under the authority of the Ministry of Interior. So at first, the state security was tasked with protecting state security and monitor social phenomena in the state, assess them, reveal their sources, causes, and the extent of their affecting state security. So this mandate was already very broad back when the SSA was founded, but over the years, the powers granted to the SSA increased. 2 years later, in 1976, all Secret Service branches of the different emirates were actually merged into the SSA, and the apparatus was moved from the authority of the Minister of Interior to the President of the UAE. In 2003, the founding law was replaced and later further amended in 2011. However, the problem is that these laws have never to date been published. And in the report that Mina Rights Group has prepared, we actually base our analysis on the 2003 version of the law, which was obtained by the Emirates Detainees Advocacy Center, and which is the only publicly available version of the law that NGOs and civil society have had access to date. So in 2003, the powers of the SSA were considerably expanded, allowing the SSA to become the highest authority on security matters and operating without any institutional, judicial, or financial oversight. It also provided the SSA with the authority to gather and analyze information on any political or organizational activity of a person, organization, or party that seeks to prejudice state security, its governance system, or national unity, which obviously is already very vague and can entail a number of acts falling under the right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, association, etc. The new law also granted very wide powers to the SSA, allowing for abuses to take place and to be committed by its agents. So as mentioned before, the SSA has the authority to monitor social phenomena affecting state security, whatever that means, and is actually allowed to take, I quote, any measure it sees fit to limit these phenomena. So they're giving a really wide range of powers. And as such, they can arrest and detain people for prolonged periods without any judicial oversight or due process guarantees. And among others, this is just one of the many powers of the SSA. The SSA president can actually order that a suspect be detained for up to 60 days, which can be extended for another 30 days before being brought before the prosecution. So beyond the crimes of monitoring social phenomena that is defined within the SSA law, the SSA also has jurisdiction over a number of crimes that are defined in other legislation, including the UAE counterterrorism law, the cybercrime law, and the penal code. And all these provisions and crimes are related to state security, and therefore the SSA has jurisdiction over them. I will briefly go over some of these legislations. So the counterterrorism law, for example, is highly problematic because the definition of a terrorist crime is very vague and does not provide for concrete acts that would actually qualify as terrorist. And in addition, acts such as declaring opposition to the state, the ruling system, also amount to terrorism under the law. And effectively, the text conflates public criticism and democratic political opposition with terrorism. In addition, the SSA also has jurisdiction over a number of so-called state security crimes that are contained in the UAE Penal Code. And this includes acts such as mocking, insulting, or causing harm to the reputation and standing of the UAE president, which, as everybody can understand, has nothing to do with an actual act of terrorism. And lastly, the cybercrime law also contains several provisions dealing with national security issues, which also fall under the competence of the SSA. So, for example, unlawful content could include anything that would harm state security, decreases public confidence in state authorities, harm the state's interests, reputation, or prestige. So again, very broad. So it's quite clear that these laws contain very vague, overbroad terminology that actually enable the authorities to punish acts protected under a number of fundamental rights and freedoms, including freedom of speech. So with these broad powers and jurisdiction in mind, it's important to highlight that although the SSA is typically the instigator of abuses, such as enforced disappearances, torture, and arbitrary detention, especially against government critics, political oppositions, journalists, human rights defenders, but not only, it has also operated collaboratively and interdependently with, on one hand, the state security prosecution, and on the other hand, the Abu Dhabi Federal Court of Appeal and the State Security Chamber of the Federal Supreme Court, which are the courts that have jurisdiction over these state security crimes. So very briefly, to understand a little bit the modus operandi and how all these institutions operate. So individuals are first arrested by the SSA, usually without any warrant or any reasons being provided for the arrest. After this, individuals are either brought to a secret detention facility or an official detention facility, police station, prison, where they are subjected to enforced disappearance or incommunicado detention. And during this period, are routinely also subjected to acts of torture and other forms of ill treatment to actually force them to make a self-incriminating statement. Later on, these individuals that were under SSA custody reappear before the state security prosecution and are charged with state security or terrorism-related charges, including those that I mentioned under the terrorism law, the penal code, or the cybercrime law. And once charged by the state security prosecution, they're brought to trial before the Abu Dhabi Federal Court of Appeal, and often sentenced on the basis of these torture-tainted confessions. And once the first instance trial is done, people actually may appeal before the State Security Chamber of the Federal Supreme Court. However, the issue is, on one hand, members of the state security prosecution are appointed by the UAE president upon approval of the Council of Ministers. So that gives, obviously, the executive great powers over the prosecution services and hampers the independence and fairness of criminal investigation. And on the other hand, when it comes to the trial of individuals accused of state security crimes, judges of both courts that I just mentioned are also appointed by presidential decree. So we clearly see that there is an excessive control of the judiciary by the executive. And again, the executive also controls the SSA. So essentially, everything links back to the UAE president. So overall, we see the great powers afforded to the state security apparatus and the lack of proper judicial oversight, which means that it effectively operates to this day with complete impunity. What this has meant in practice is gross human rights abuses being committed by state security agents. The reports provides a number of examples and cases that illustrates such practices. But overall, key core human rights violations include arbitrary arrests and enforced disappearances. As I mentioned earlier, for example, even if the SSA can technically hold suspects for up to 90 days, in practice, in multiple cases, we've seen individuals that are detained even beyond that period. Again, the practice of torture and ill treatment is widespread. The UAE was actually reviewed in July 2022 by the UN Committee Against Torture for the first time, and the committee found that there was a pattern of torture against human rights defenders and persons accused of offenses against state security. And last but not least, so all the violations that I mentioned above are obviously constitutive elements of the practice of arbitrary detention, but I also want to highlight that detainees held by the SSA are routinely denied their fundamental legal safeguards. So that means, for example, having access to a lawyer or being brought promptly before a judicial authority, being able to challenge the legality of their detention, etc. And then the last sort of piece of the puzzle is that people are charged for based on these vague provisions and then tried before these courts that lack independence. And obviously, those confessions that were obtained by the SSA are again often admitted as the sole piece of evidence in court. I will keep it to that, and we'll leave Matthew to speak. And
Thank you, Ines. And thank you for sharing your insights that you provided, for shedding light on violations committed against the UAE 94 by the SSA, and also looking at the development of the SSA through the years from 1974 until now, and the increase in powers and responsibilities that has accompanied this development. And also looking at the kind of use of these state security laws and the counterterrorism laws, and the vague terminology in their provisions to punish dissent, and for also shedding light on not just the state security apparatus, but its partners in crimes, looking at state security prosecution and the federal courts, which cannot be considered independent or impartial, and also for kind of laying out the modus operandi of the SSA, including its pattern of enforced disappearances, torture, and arbitrary detention. Before moving on to Matthew and hearing your testimony, I'd like to just briefly hear the testimony of Janan Al-Marzouqi, who has sent us a pre-recorded video. Janan is an Emirati human rights defender, and she is the daughter of Abdussalam Darwish Al-Marzouqi, who is an Emirati prisoner of conscience. Abdussalam Darwish Al-Marzouqi was arrested on July 24, 2012 as part of the UAE authorities' crackdown on the UAE 94. And on July 2, 2013, he was sentenced by the Federal Supreme Court to 10 years in prison for acts that were related to his exercise of the right to freedom of expression and opinion. He remains arbitrarily detained until to this day in a Razim prison under the Munasaha, or the counseling regime. This is despite the fact that he completed his 10-year sentence in July of this year. And so we are honored to be sharing the testimony of Janan, which she has kindly sent to us.
Hi, first of all, thank you for discussing this very critical topic and for allowing me the opportunity to share with you some of the human rights violations my father, along with several other prisoners of conscience, are experiencing in the UAE. Unfortunately, during the last decade, the UAE has been involved in continuous systematic human rights violations, starting by detaining activists, academics, and lawyers, sentencing them for years in grossly unfair trials based on vague and broad charges solely for practicing their rights to free expression and association, and ending with indefinite detention, which is exactly what's happening right now. The situation with my father, Abdussalam Darwish Al-Marzouqi, is a perfect example of the human rights violations that we are discussing today. It started around 2011, 2012, when the state security forces initiated the infamous massive arrest campaign, which included my father. I personally witnessed the night of his arrest and the subsequent brutal treatment he experienced throughout the years. State security forcibly disappeared him for 8 months. He was kept in a solitary confinement where he was subjected to torture and severe human rights violations. He endured severe mistreatment ranging from denied medical care to horrific death threats. Unfortunately, it didn't end there. During the trials, he experienced more violations. He ended up being sentenced for 10 years in prison without any legal basis to his charges. Despite testifying that he was interrogated under torture and thrown in solitary confinement, his charges were not subjected to appeal. He served his sentence in Al-Azim prison, where he continued to experience mistreatment and violations against his human rights. His rights to calls and visits were denied, along with access to books and news, and even the right to submit complaints about ill treatment to higher authorities. Their goal in this is trying to keep my father and other prisoners like him isolated from the outside world. The prisoners are not allowed to talk about their experiences, and if they try to talk about it, they receive immediate punishment. Punishment can vary from disconnecting the phone calls or the visits, denying future phone calls or visits, and ending up in solitary confinement. Everything I've mentioned so far is just pieces of one long story of the abuse my father has suffered. We thought, all of this would come to an end when he was released from prison. That was supposed to happen 5 months ago in July when his sentence ended, yet he is still being held in prison. In addition to all of this, he has been denied regular visitation since 2020, and for around a month now, he has been denied access to phone calls. Unfortunately, my father's story is not unique. He and 48 other detainees are being held indefinitely under the counseling clause because they are considered a quote-unquote terrorist risk. These broad terms facilitate the process of arbitrary detention in front of the public, both locally and internationally, in an attempt to hide their illegal practices. This in and of itself is another form of human rights violation. They have no official definition of what a terrorist risk is. It is a subjective opinion from a public prosecutor. Prosecutors and state security officers have the right to keep detainees indefinitely without having any legal justification. On September 21st from this year, my father attended a virtual court session to justify the extension of his detention at the counseling center. Prior to the session, he wasn't even allowed to meet with his lawyer. Was it a surprise? No. This wasn't the first time they have denied his right to meet with his lawyer. 10 years ago, when he began his original trials, they also denied him access to his lawyer initially. Nevertheless, I don't think the presence of a lawyer would have made any difference because he was already guilty in the eyes of the law. My reasoning for thinking this is based on Article 9 of the National Counseling Center Law. It is stated that the continuation and termination of the counseling program shall be done by a decision of the prosecutor's office and in coordination with the competent authority. Article 11 also states that the place may be released only by a decision of the prosecutors general or of the competent court at the request of the prosecutor general. So this means that the court does not have the right to release detainees unless the state security prosecutor's office makes a request. Therefore, the court's decision is only a formal procedure aimed at legitimizing the arbitrary detention practiced by the state security prosecutor's office. Of course, there are other problems with the law, namely that it does not set a specific period for the detention decision, which means that the detention can continue indefinitely. Furthermore, the law does not clarify what criteria the prosecution or the court will rely on to classify if a person poses a terrorist threat. Not to mention the fact that there aren't any counseling centers or programs to which the detainee is subjected. The detainee remains at the same prison in a program that is closer to revenge than counseling. This is evidenced by the fact that although the UAE authorities began to counsel the group of the Emirates 94, none of them have left these centers so far. There are people who have been more than 3 years beyond their sentences and yet not released. In addition, it has not happened that the court has decided that one of the people who are required to be placed in counseling centers does not constitute a terrorist threat. I mean, as we can see, human rights violations in the UAE has been in an increasing trend because the law itself doesn't provide sufficient guarantees to prevent human rights violations. And when these violations occur and are documented by the victims or their families, they're ignored. Not only are the victims ignored, but violators have never been held accountable. Instead, the victims are the ones who are suffering the consequences. Now, to solve this problem and bring these violations to an end, a first step should be making major changes to the legal text and establishing a separate and fair judicial system that is not under the influence of any other authority to ensure that human rights are being protected in the UAE. We need a major and systematic change to solve this issue. I don't have the exact technicality of how to implement that, but if the inside, meaning the government and higher authorities who have the power, are not willing to make these changes, then there should be an external pressure that we need to put on the UAE to make sure human rights violations do escalate and violators are being held accountable. I'm looking forward to that day and to the day we'll witness the release of the last prisoner of conscience. Thank you.
Thank you to Janan for sharing with us her powerful and painful testimony recounting the mass arrest of the UAE 94 and the mistreatment and violations to which they have been subjected to since their arrest to this day, including arbitrary detention, as Janan described, under the Munasaha regime, and as also Janan described, shedding light on this regime and the many violations enabled by the law and its vague provisions. Last but certainly not least, I'd like to give the floor to Matthew Hedges. Matthew is an academic who is focusing on authoritarianism. While Matthew was conducting fieldwork for his research for his PhD in the UAE, he was detained, tortured, and sentenced to life under the charge of espionage on behalf of the British government. He was awarded his doctorate by Durham University and has since published his dissertation as Reinventing the Sheikhdom, Clan, Power, and Patronage in MBZ's UAE. His current research focuses on the commercial activities of non-Western intelligence organizations. Matthew, thank you for being with us today, and you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ramzi and Inez, for organizing this and putting all this really crucial data together on a state which has been able to circumvent certain spotlights. What's really interesting here is, the Emirati state security, it's the biggest power and authority it has. It's over its own citizens. And these are the ones that end up disappearing for long periods of time. And, they've got nobody else to protect them. So just very broadly speaking, state security as a concept, as universally speaking, it's something which is completely politically directed and oriented. And their remits are not just, a secret police. They are state security, and its personnel are everywhere. So when we look at the current modern manifestation of what the state security is in the UAE, of course, you have that formal legal hierarchy. The Minister of State Security is, is the eldest son of the president. It's Khalid bin Mohammed bin Zayed. So when we discussed that centralization of power and how it's all directed, from the president himself, within a federal state that is the UAE, this is even more concentrated within a nuclear and biological family. This is when the state security starts to then morph into not working into the interests of that wider social and political community, but very specifically for the interests of that ruling elite. You raised and you discussed the issues of how this is then used across the state. But I think one of the most alarming, one of the most identifiable other events that has occurred, and it shows the level of their domestic power, was following the death of around 50 Emirati soldiers in 2015 from a missile attack in Yemen, there were some protests in the northern emirate of Ras Al Khaimah. As a result, Emirati State Security from Abu Dhabi, they detained the emir of Ras Al Khaimah and his brother, who is the head of police in the emirate. And they detained them for failing to be able to control those social insecurities, that social unhappiness and unrest. If the state security has power over leaders of individual emirates and police forces, this tells you really where that hierarchy lies. It tells you how sovereign they are as an institution and as individuals. Inez discussed the legal parameters. When, as was highlighted, you are maybe denied a lawyer, absolutely. But even when you are eventually presented with a lawyer as part of the attempt to demonstrate legitimacy for the legal process, this is not any old lawyer. This is one that's appointed by the state security and has access to that information, which nobody else does. But what we've then seen in the case of, say, Mohammed Al-Rukan, even if you then go to represent someone in a state security court, you will then be prosecuted yourself. It's akin really to other examples around the world where they have similar institutions, such as in Russia, where they are show trials. They are nothing else. They are not designed to demonstrate a legal, code, a construction to it, but to demonstrate the power of the state, to enable them to continue doing this. This goes from the time of your abduction, if that's the best way to call it, because, as you said, they don't need to have a formal charge. They can detain you as they like. The legitimacy of this and how it's then granted is built into the engagement with the state security prosecutor and others. But ultimately, they have that sovereign ability to dictate terms how they would like. So combined, it is that total environment, that suffocation of information, that suffocation of rights, to be able to defend yourself, to be able to survive when everything is against you. They will intimidate your family. They will intimidate lawyers if they are not within that realm. If you're an Emirati national yourself, there is nobody else that they can intimidate. The pressure is all on you, and you're against a monolithic entity that doesn't have any restrictions. We speak about them here in regards to those human rights, but not all individuals within state security are officers, so to say. They may be part-time within wider parts of the bureaucracy, but help a lending hand in certain operations or certain exercises if they're involved in business. And they become a somewhat informal network. They become a wider set of eyes through which the state can assume control. And it then questions I suppose, independence. Are people doing this as to defend themselves and to stop themselves from being prosecuted, or are they doing it for that greater good? Are they doing it to pursue this? And if there are fewer and fewer pillars of independence, if there are fewer and fewer ways in which people can demonstrate strength away from the state, then it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. Traditionally, this was they would play on those societal links, tribes, families, and so forth. But the adoption and integration of technology has given them a magnified capability. We've seen this with the Pegasus hacking. This happened with the $1 million advocate in Ahmed Mansour. We've seen it more recently, hacking members of parliament, heads of state. But that really is a clear demonstration that there are no lines with which they wouldn't cross. The world they live in and they inhabit is also one which is it's kind of rose tinted. They see everything as a threat. You're guilty until proven innocent, through which you'll never be able to find and prove yourself innocent. You just have to find a way to survive. So with the Emiratis, the Emirati prisoners within the system, there is you either try to maintain a position of strength and independence, or you actually become part of it. You reinforce it. You provide the legitimacy. You become a mouthpiece. You push the ideas that they want you to push. I think that's maybe one of the most worrying things going forward. You speak about the formal structure of the judges of the legislation, but if it becomes a mindset, that's not something that you can easily change. I suppose that the growing issue is now Mohammed bin Zayed is the president of the UAE, and it's a very centralized family nuclear organization. How will the state security, how will this impact, that the continued fragility or the continued strength of the state? I think going forward, that'll be a really interesting relationship or dynamic to watch, because they're just going to assume more and more power for this. I just wanted to give a little bit of background, really, to build upon your great work and research. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for your testimony and for shedding light on the control and authority of the SSA, and perhaps the violations enabled by this control and authority and the centralization of power over the years. Maybe I have a few questions I'd like to ask of you and Ines, since you're with us, but perhaps before asking my own questions, I just want to open the floor to see if you have any thoughts to share or remarks, given what we heard from all the panelists, from Jeanette, from Matthew, from Ines. So if there's anything you'd like to add, I'd like to give you the floor now.
Sorry, go ahead.
Please.
Actually, I wanted to respond to what you shared with us, Matthew, which is very interesting, regarding the more kind of policy aspect of the SSA. So the SSA has the power actually to establish state security offices in any governmental entity, company, embassies, consulates, prison. Actually, after Ahmed Mansour was sentenced to prison in 2018, they put a paper on the door of his cell saying, for anything, you have to go to the Security Information Branch, which, according to Human Rights Watch and a report they published on Ahmed Mansour, actually refers to state security. So effectively, it means that in the prison, they can go and basically say this detainee, is under sort of our supervision. And I was curious to hear from Matthew, because I know during your detention in the UAE, you were actually held at the CID building, in the criminal investigation building, and so technically it's a service or department that's different from the SSA. However, you were held by the SSA, interrogating by the SSA. So I'm just kind of curious to hear your testimony on that.
So I don't read Arabic, but it was the perception that it was as you said, they created a certain domain. It was a different realm in those 4 or 5 rooms, whatever it was, where different rules can apply. It's like drawing a new line, right? You're redefining those boundaries in the same way that you've heard of Western states have black sites, and they'll go and they'll say, in this part of the base, this is actually not our territory. It's I don't know, it's international waters or something. And by doing that, you can legitimize certain behaviors. And in the summer, when we were at the Committee Against Torture, the Emirati delegation discussed how it was codified in law to protect human rights. It was to have access to a lawyer and so forth. However, the parallel state security legislation overrides this and removes many of those protections. So it's easy to say, well, here's the evidence, but actually it's conflicting, and this is not entirely true. It's a trump card which has, as I said, it's the most worrying thing about it is that centralized nuclear family control of it. This tells you where the state is going forward. It is very, very, very very small and very it's a strong network, between them that have ultimate power. And so, when you do hear about state security prisoners and the conditions they're in, some people are lucky to get out and others aren't. For the Emiratis themselves, it's obviously a kind of a black hole where they just disappear, and it's up to families to try and do something about it. But what they end up doing is, as like a communal punishment, is to, they will take away their nationality. This was another tactic that people would do to state security, or the Emiratis in general would do to remove that constitutional protection for them.
Yeah, and to add to your point, Matthew, actually, with Abdel Salam Darwish al-Marzouqi, I believe, if I'm correct, he was stripped of his nationality, and his children as well, in retaliation or reprisals for actions he took that are protected under the right to freedom of expression. Just adding to that, I'd like to now maybe ask about accountability and what that looks like. What is, maybe both, this question is directed to both of you, Ines and Matthew. What do avenues of accountability for victims of violations in the UAE look like now? And if there aren't any avenues at the local level, what avenues are available to people in general to pursue in order to gain accountability for, or justice for, violations that they've suffered?
I'm happy to go first. I mean, as you highlighted, like it's impossible to achieve any form of accountability at the domestic level, just because there is purely and simply lack of political will to change anything. At the more like international level, we have seen some actions, for example, taken by UN human rights mechanisms. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, for example, has issued a number of opinions on cases of individuals who are detained arbitrarily in the United Arab Emirates. They even said that the number of cases from the UAE brought to their attention led them to conclude that there was a pattern of arbitrary detention, which could also constitute a crime against humanity. As we talked about earlier, there was the review by the UN Committee Against Torture this summer. This was the first actually review since the UAE ratified the Convention Against Torture in 2012. So obviously, these mechanisms are there to collect information from the state, from NGOs, from victims, and make conclusions, make recommendations, and we'll see whether those recommendations are going to be effectively implemented in practice. The UAE should be actually following up on several top priority recommendations from the Committee Against Torture by July 2023, including actually a recommendation related to state security. So more related to addressing the reinforcing, the legal framework pertaining to state security, ensuring that there is no secret incommunicado detention, etc., etc. So it will be interesting to see whether there will be any changes, and whether the UAE authorities will actually try to implement those recommendations. And in any case, civil society will be closely following up on that. And I also want to highlight that the UAE are going to be reviewed by the UN Human Rights Council in the context of the Universal Periodic Review in May 2023. So obviously the Universal Periodic Review is more of a peer review process, but it's also an opportunity for civil society, for victims to also engage with like-minded states to try and well raise some of our key concerns and success recommendations that we believe are important. And I'm actually curious to hear from Matthew, because I believe he's been also involved in like several lawsuits, and I think lawsuits outside of the UAE, universal jurisdiction, etc., can also be an avenue to try and seek justice. And I'm just curious to have your view on what that has sort of brought as of now, and whether you think or are hopeful that this will be a way to achieve accountability.
So before I get to the international, just have to mention the domestic. They have a Human Rights Council, and they have the Emiratis do highlight avenues through which to be able to raise these human rights abuses and to raise issues of torture. But as you rightly said, in the system that is, there is no separation of powers, and you are kept in conditions of coercion. It is practically impossible for you to be able to continue doing this. Let alone I think the recent human rights entity that was created in the UAE to overlook this is actually housed within the Ministry of Presidential Affairs. So when it comes to independence, when it comes to oversight and so forth, it doesn't scream degree of freedom. Now internationally, as you rightly said, we have a civil case in the UK against 4 individuals. And this is because I'm a UK national, I'm based here. The court said that this could be issued out of jurisdiction. They were happy to hear it, and it's going forward in court on that basis. In other countries, as you rightly said, because the UAE are signatories to the Convention Against Torture, universal jurisdiction can apply if we can justify to another state why it's relevant to do so. So I could go to Papua New Guinea, but they would understandably say, well, why should we try and do this in this territory? There are other reasons to be able to apply it, being if people reside there, if people travel through, and so forth. So we have a case in France, because one of the 4 persons that we have a civil case against is now the current president of Interpol. As a result, he has to travel to France a fair amount, and this is then being investigated in France. There are, it's a very complicated matter. Obviously, justice would be then a charge and indictment against the individuals involved for their participation in this. What you end up having, and in my case, it's me as an individual, it is my barrister and my lawyers, with relatively limited funds against an entire state. Whilst we have the cases against 4 individuals, because it's to do with the integrity and the authority of the entire state and this judicial application, and then on top of that the diplomatic implications and foreign interference and so forth, foreign relations, we are up against an almighty powerful entity that has the interest and resources to maintain it. I've been back for 4 years, and this tells you how slow the process is, and by slowing it down, it's an attempt to frustrate, to make it more expensive. And that responsibility then comes on individuals to be able to maintain it, even if they can get themselves in that position. So in essence, it becomes a nearly impossible task. So you just have to keep on raising it, like when we submitted evidence and participated at the UN Committee Against Torture, participating in events like this, and to your your document to be able to try and highlight those issues, so in the future these things may not happen again, or at least states and the public become more aware of it. It's like a social and public accountability. If we can get that legal accountability, that is the objective, but it's not an equal, it's not an easy task.
Yeah, thank you, Ines and Matthew, for your remarks, I guess, and shedding light both on the avenues of accountability and also limitations and challenges that these avenues themselves also pose. We're getting near the end of our time. We have 2 minutes left, and perhaps I could just ask one quick question, maybe a 1-minute response each from Ines or Matthew, just reflecting on what would be needed concretely from the UAE authorities to address the abuses taking place and stop them from happening, if anything comes to mind. Yeah, maybe a quick remark from both of you would be greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Ramzi. And yeah, as Jinan actually highlight in her statement, what's needed is like structural changes as well at the let's say more like legal framework level, but that can happen without political will. You know, the UAE is a country where there is no, I mean, there is a sort of parliament, but there is no effective, you know, independent legislative power, and everything is in the hands of the executive. So it's really hard to kind of try and see how any change can happen without that political will. And I think Matthew's comment is actually interesting regarding not just like sort of legal accountability, but social accountability, and also how to raise more awareness about human rights abuses in the UAE, because unlike other countries of the MENA region, among others, like there is like less awareness about the, you know, the reality of the situation and the gravity of the abuses that are being committed on the ground. So the work, you know, that is being done to shed light on these abuses, the testimonies that are being shared by Matthew, by Jinan, and others, you know, that I also wanna, you know, salute for their perseverance in, you know, also sharing these testimonies over and over again and trying to raise awareness on the situation. It's also extremely important. And one last point, and I'm actually curious to hear Matthew's views on that, is also the role that other third countries play, you know, that are very closely allied with the UAE. I mean, we haven't gone into Yemen because this is not the topic of the discussion today. But you know, issues of arms sales, etc., are also very concerning. And I think close allies like, you know, the US or the UK also have a role to play. Whether they have played it, that's really another question. And we don't have enough time for this today. But I'll leave it to that. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's absolutely, I think that last point, these, you know, international partners and states know what happens in these countries. They are aware of it. They've had records of it. They are the institutions that can help elevate it. It's not so much maybe to sit and point fingers, because that easily comes backwards, but it's just to illustrate and demonstrate that people have raised these issues in this country. You know, when you go to a travel advice page, it says, you know, it's not safe, it's safe, COVID, and so forth. Highlight the fact that this occurs, and the state security is part of the legal apparatus, and by doing so, you position it as part of that legitimate discussion, right? Because it's going to be impossible to get a state to sit there and point it unless it's politically charged, and there's a political will to do so. So at least highlight the fact that it exists, and there have been claims of abuse by them. That way, other people can then do the research. They can then try and find a way to make their own decision, and that's when they will see that there are endemic problems.
Thank you, Ines. Thank you, Matthew, for these critical reflections and for being part of this panel today. Also, I want to just send a big thank you for Janan for sending her or sharing her powerful testimony. And yeah, thanks for having this panel discussion and being with us. Again, for anyone who's watching online on Twitter or elsewhere, if you'd like to know more about the state security apparatus, its structure, its framework, and its pattern of abuses, MENA Rights Group published its report on the SSA today. It's available on the website, menarights.org. And we look forward to continuing this discussion in other avenues and locations. Thanks again for joining us, and we hope to be in touch again soon. By Matthew, by Ines.